Chapter 6. A blazing headline. Nancy stared at the glittery, heart-shaped rhinestone lying among Gregory's things. It had to have fallen off one of the Cinderella slippers. Did this mean that Gregory was the slipper thief? That looks like one of the rhinestones from the Cinderella slippers, Nancy said, pointing to the jewel. Gregory stared at the rhinestone. His cheeks flushed red. That's not mine, he said quickly. I don't know how it got there. Nancy tried to figure out if Gregory was lying. She couldn't tell. Still, he seemed to be hiding something. You don't know how it got there? Nancy asked him. No way, Gregory said. It's definitely not yours, Nancy persisted. Gregory shook his head. Nancy picked up the rhinestone. Can I have it then? Sure, Gregory said with a shrug. I don't want it. Scruffy nuzzled his nose in Nancy's hand and sniffed the rhinestone. He began barking loudly. What's the matter, boy? Nancy asked him. Scruffy continued to bark at the jewel. Scruffy, be quiet, Gregory said. He picked up one of his dirty socks and threw it across the floor. The fat, Scruffy, he ordered. Just then, Nancy got an idea. While Gregory watched Scruffy fetch his sock, he leaned over and peeked into his dance bag. If Gregory was the slipper thief, the slippers might be in there, but they weren't. All she could see was a paperback book, a magazine, and a magnifying glass. A magnifying glass? Nancy frowned. What was Gregory doing with that? Scruffy had finally stopped barking and was chewing vigorously on Gregory's sock. Nancy turned to Gregory with a smile. So, why are you carrying a magnifying glass in your dance bag? She asked him. Gregory started. Hey, what are you doing looking in my bag? He demanded. It was open, and I just happened to, Nancy began. Gregory picked up his belongings and threw them into his bag. You should stop poking around in other people's stuff, he said gruffly. With that, he grabbed his bag and headed over to the bar. That night, the Clue Crew met at Nancy's house to go over their case. Nancy and Beth sat Nancy and Beth sat cross-legged on Nancy's bed while George sat at Nancy's desk. We have two new clues, Nancy announced. She held out the heart-shaped rhinestone and a piece of paper that said Tale 35. Beth and George studied them carefully. What does tale mean? Beth mused. Did somebody misspell the word tail as in a doggy tail? Maybe it's in code, George suggested. I wondered about that too, Nancy said. In any case, I think it's definitely a clue because the letters are just like the fancy letters on the slipper shoebox. George typed all this into Nancy's computer. I know, she said suddenly. Why don't I do a search for word tail on the internet? That's an awesome idea, Nancy said eagerly. George got on the internet and typed in a series of commands. After a moment, she glanced up from the computer. It's a French word pronounced like tie, she announced. It means size. Size? Beth frowned. So, tail 35 means size 35? I've never heard of a size 35, Nancy said. Me neither, George said. It sounds really, really big. George entered this new information into the computer. As she typed, Beth took the rhinestone from Nancy and examined it closely. It's so pretty, Bessie said. Then she frowned. If Gregory stole the Cinderella slippers and put them in his dance bag, the rhinestone could have fallen off one of the slippers. Or someone could have planted the rhinestone there to make him look guilty, Nancy pointed out. George looked up from the computer. We have three clues now. The beret, the piece of paper with a tail 35 or size 35 on it, and the rhinestone heart. She reminded the other members of the clue crew. The barrette doesn't exactly fit with Gregory being the thief. That's true, Nancy agreed, although Gregory sure owns a lot of weird stuff. Today I saw a magnifying glass in his dance bag. A magnifying glass? Bess repeated. Who does he think he is? Sherlock Holmes? Just then, a bell-like ting sounded on Nancy's computer. George appeared at the screen. Andrea is instant messaging us, she announced. What did she say? Nancy asked, leaning over. She says, check out Deirdre's website right away, George read. Deirdre's website? Bess repeated, looking confused. George typed in the address for the Dishing with a Deirdre site. Nancy and Bess got up from the bed and gathered around George. The homepage of Dishing with Deirdre filled Nancy's computer screen. Across the top of it was the blazing headline, Who Stole Cinderella's Shoes? What? Bess burst out. Typical Deirdre, George muttered. Nancy reached forward for the mouse and used it to scroll down the page. Deirdre had written a late breaking story about the thief of the Cinderella slippers from Tim McGuire's dance studio. Then Nancy noticed something strange. Deirdre had included a photograph of the Cinderella slippers. The slippers were lined up on a sidewalk in front of a brick wall. What is wrong with this picture? Nancy asked herself.